Ding Liren is the second highest rated player in the world. He's the only player other than Magnus Carlsen to be currently rated over 2,800 as of the recording of this video. Perugia just dropped a little bit below after his last tournament. And Ding Liren is also the number one seed of the upcoming candidates to determine who's going to be facing Magnus Carlsen. So I'd like to look at one of his games. This is against Artemiev, who's rated 2,700, a very strong opponent. This was played at the Air Things Masters knockout. Both sides have 15 minutes with a 10-second increment. Ding Liren has the white pieces. Artemiev has the black. Let's jump right in. Ding Liren plays d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3. We have a mainline Queen's Gambit declined. Artemiev plays knight to f6. And Ding Liren decides to play the exchange variation. He takes in the center, and we have the Carlsbad structure where white's pawns aim towards the queen side, black's pawns aim towards the king side. So the first thing Ding Liren does is get his bishop, his queen's bishop, outside of the pawn chain. This is very important in a Carlsbad structure, that you get that bishop outside of the pawn chain. c6, e3, h6. Artemiev immediately asks that bishop at g5, what does it want to do? And Ding Liren retreats it to h4. He doesn't want to take that knight and give up the two bishops. Bishop to e7 to relieve that pin, bishop to d3, castles, and knight g to e2. Now, we know in the Carlsbad, when white plays the knight to e2 instead of to f3, the point is to play the pawn to f3 and then play e4. White wants to build a big pawn center with f3 and e4, so he doesn't block that f-pawn. Rook to e8, the rook on the half-open file, castles. a5, Artemiev begins to gain space on the queen side, controls the b4 square, so any idea from white of playing a minority attack is limited, greatly limited by this move. Rook to c1, Ding Liren places his rook on the half-open c-file, knight b to d7, and now f3. This process of expanding in the center begins. It probably takes a while in most games for e4 to actually be played, but it sort of hovers over the board for the next few moves. Artemiev continues his expansion on the queen side with b5. And while this does gain space, it also does create some weaknesses. The c5 square is weak, and the c6 pawn is backwards on a half-open file. So there are some weaknesses created along with the space that is gained. Bishop to f2, the bishop returns, defends e3, will defend e4 after the pawn is pushed to e4. Knight to b6. The knight can jump into c4, but also if black were to play b4 himself, now the knight at c3 can't move to the a4 square. It would have to play to the passive b1 square. So Ding Liren plays knight to f4. The idea is to keep pressure on d5, but also allow this c3 knight to move to the e2 square if it gets hit. A more natural move is probably to play knight to g3 with the idea of going to f5. His idea of knight to f4, a little more aggressive, keeps some pressure on the d5 square. Bishop to d6 aims at this knight on f4 and keeps white from playing e4 because the knight would hang. White plays b3 to keep the knight out of the c4 square. Bishop to d7 defends the backwards pawn. And now bishop to b1. One of the ideas behind this move is that the queen can go to c2, and the bishop and queen can aim at the king side, but also the rook and queen are putting pressure on the half-open file, putting pressure on c6 and c5. So Artemiev plays bishop to a3. These newly weakened dark squares on the queen side allow him to irritate that c1 rook, which needs to move. It moves to c2, and now bishop to f5 hits it again after the rook moves. Now bishop takes b1, queen takes b1. And this is a strategic victory for black. He has taken his bad bishop, bad because his central pawns are on the same color as that bishop, and traded it for white's good bishop, the strong light-squared bishop. So that's a strategic victory. And he has space, but he still has these weaknesses, and Ding Liren has yet to play his strong e4 move. Bishop to d6 goes back to hitting this knight, preventing e4 from being played. Rook to c2. Ding Liren begins to focus his concentration on the half-open c-file again. Rook to c8, knight to d3. Now what this does, the knight does aim at c5 or e5, but also it clears the way for e4 to potentially be played. The knight would not hang as it would have on f4. Queen to e7. putting pressure on the half-open e-file, trying to limit the e4 expansion. Knight to e2 unveils the rook against the c-pawn, knight b to d7, and now knight to g3. And white is threatening to jump into f5 with the knight and trade off the knight for this very strong dark squared bishop, and Artemiev does not want that. So he plays g6, keeping that f5 square under control so the knight can't go there. It does weaken his king a bit, but it's more important to control that f5 square. He figures white's going to be playing on the queen side anyway. Rook f to c1, doubling on the half-open c-file. Bishop a3 again, irritating the rook at c1. The rook moves. And now c5. And this is a very important moment because Ding Liren has a couple of choices here. One thing he can do is just take on c5, and after knight takes, knight to f4, he's got some slight pressure against d5, and this is an equal position, but white can sort of work on the weaknesses in black's structure for a while. Or he can play the much more complicated move, e4, and that is what he plays in this game. He chooses the most complex path because I assume it's because he feels it gives him the best winning chances. He knows against a 2,700 player, he has to play a very complicated game in order to have a chance to win. And so he jumps in there, e4, and then look at all of this tension in the center of the board. Artemiev plays c4, and this does shut down the c-file. There was this nice half-open c-file. Now that, for the moment, is closed. Pawn takes, and Artemiev has a choice. One move he can play here is dc4. Now that allows white to keep this really beautiful center, but black's queenside pawns are quite strong and can become a very nasty menace very, very quickly. I wonder if that was not the best option. It might have been the better option. He instead chooses to play bc4. And after knight f4, Ding Liren is putting some pressure on the base of that pawn chain. There's quite a lot of pressure on d5. So black takes on e4. And Ding Liren takes with the knight. I wonder if maybe taking with the pawn, leaving himself with that really nice pawn center, wasn't the better choice here. He takes with the knight, and then knight to e4. Now this allows white to repair that, and now white has the center that they wanted anyway. Perhaps a better choice would have been something like queen to b4. I mean, there are other choices, offering the trade of queens and just letting this pawn stay weak and not connecting those central pawns and giving them that strength. But he takes on e4 and fe4, and now Ding Liren has that very nice central structure. Queen to g5 hits the knight at f4, g3. Now that defends the knight, but it creates all these light squared weaknesses around white's king. An interesting choice by Ding Liren, but there's a good reason for it, as we shall see. Knight to f6 hits the e4 pawn. h4 attacks the queen. The queen settles in on g4, a nice, comfortable square for the queen. And the e4 pawn is still being attacked. Something has to be done. He decides to advance it to e5. The knight goes to h5, trading off that well-placed knight on f4. Knight takes, queen to b5, attacking the two weak pawns at a5 and c4. Now here, Artemiev plays the queen to f3, which makes sense. He's trying to put some pressure on these newly weakened squares. But there aren't any other pieces that can help the queen attack those squares. I mean, if he could replace the dark squared bishop with a light squared bishop, just take the dark squared bishop off the board and put a light squared bishop on the board instead, black's probably just winning. You know, the light squares are just too weak. But here, there's no other piece that can really assist the queen. Perhaps a better choice was bishop to b4, defending the a5 pawn. And he can't take on c4 because he would just lose the rook to the bishop, lose the exchange. And after a move like, say, rookie to c1, c3, and black has a decent position. White still has the nice center, but black has the queenside pawns. But Artemiev plays the queen to f3, rook takes, queen to d3, rook to c5, and he goes ahead and takes the queen here. Queen to f3 at least keeps some tension on the board. But after queen takes, rook takes, now Ding Liren has a very nice endgame with these central pawns. Rook to c2, rook to e3, counterattacking the bishop at a3, bishop to b4, a3, bishop to d2, rook f3, and bishop to c3, putting some pressure on the d4 pawn. Rook to b7, and Ding Liren is attacking f7 with both rooks, and that's very hard for black to deal with. He plays the rook to d8. What if he just defends the f7 pawn directly with rook to f8? Well, in that case, rook to c7 pins that bishop and creates all kinds of trouble for black. After rook to d8, he plays the same move anyway. He just pins the bishop. In order to get out of it, Artemiev has to check first. Rook to c1, king moves up, and now bishop to b2. The bishop can defend the rook. But Ding Liren doesn't trade rooks. He just takes on f7. Rook c f7, rook to c2, e6. And now this pawn begins to march, and as you can see, it's very close to the queening square. Rook to e8, e7. The threat is rook to f8 check, which would win on the spot. Artemiev takes at a3 with the bishop. The idea is hopefully the bishop can lend some control to the f8 square, but as it turns out, it's not enough. Ding Liren plays rook to f8. After rook takes, rook f8, and Artemiev resigned in this position because after the king moves, he would just promote to a queen and the game would be over. So this is an excellent game from the second highest rated player in the world and definitely one of the favorites to win the candidates. I hope you've enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.